Good morning, everyone. Today, we have the honor of presenting David Hogg, a student survivor of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School shooting that occurred last February in Parkland, Florida.
David is now an author, an advocate, and activist in the U.S., and the co-founder of the March for Our Lives movement. And he is here today to speak to us about how our generation can make an impact by participating as members of a representative democracy.
We are honored to have David here today and sincerely hope you all enjoy, but most importantly, respect today's presentation and understand its relevance to us not only as students, but as the future of our country. This isn't a talk about political parties. This is about standing up for our own rights and the lives of others. So we hope you will share in our enthusiasm for hearing what David has to say.
So with that, please join us in welcoming David Hogg to the podium.
Hey guys, who's ready to save our generation? Are we? Thank you all for having me today. Thank you to the amazing student organizers from student government that have allowed me to come and speak today. And thank you all for being here to listen to this important message that in reality is not a partisan issue. Because what we advocate for, what our generation advocates for, is simply to stop dying. And if we think that's a partisan issue, we got a bigger issue in America, right? Because this movement is not about gun control. This movement is about stopping every kid in America from dying, no matter the zip code, no matter what they look like, no matter where they come from. Because we realize that only creating new gun laws that disarm people that are like domestic abusers, terrorists, and people that want to kill themselves is not going to end gun violence. We're going to have to approach it from a violence perspective as well. By only creating new laws, we cannot end violence. We have to create new laws, but we also have to stop violence at where it's starting through the generational trauma that many students across America have to face in the first place. Because we realize as young people that what freedom looks like is not living in constant fear in our communities, in our schools, and in our parks from any form of gun violence, whether that be a mass shooting or an everyday shooting or a drive-by shooting, or whether that be state-sanctioned violence in the form of police brutality. Because we realize that every type of gun violence matters. And even though our Congress does not care about many communities across America, even though many politicians that are currently in power do not care about many communities that don't have as much political power across America, our generation can be the one to change that. Our generation can be the one to stand up and elect a Congress that actually looks like America and not just a bunch of CEOs. Our generation can be the generation that changes the belief that young people should not be politically active. Because when older generations say that young people shouldn't be politically active, that is not an excuse for us to become inactive. That is an excuse to fund our education, right? There is an immense amount of work for us to do. And the only good thing about having a broken world is that there is no shortage of young people that are out there willing to fix it. There's no shortage of especially young people in Massachusetts that are out here doing this amazing work. And before I go on further about about this movement and what we've built, I'm going to talk about what brought me to this place today. And that's February 14th, 2018. February 14th is a day that I will always remember. And it was a day at my school where, as many of us know as high schoolers, high school is not always the most happy or upbeat place, right? Oftentimes, students don't want to even be here, quite frankly, because we start school so early and we stay up so late doing our own work oftentimes, or just playing video games, or just watching YouTube, or watching The Office, right? But that day was different at my school. For the first time in my high school career of going to Marjory Stoneman Douglas, I had seen a majority of the campus actually happy. The majority of the campus actually looked like they wanted to be there. A majority of the students there had love in their hearts and in their actions, too. Our friend Emma Gonzalez, who was the president of the Gay Straight Alliance at the time, was working on handing out carnations and Valentines to many of the students that didn't have a boyfriend or girlfriend, to know that even if they're just friends, that they are loved. My friend Diego Pfeiffer wrote a letter to every single one of his friends to make sure, every single one of his friends that didn't have a significant other, to make sure that they knew that they were loved. And that day was really like no other that I had seen before, where everybody was actually smiling at our school. Everybody was happy. And the night before that day, Manuel Oliver went out with his son, Joaquin Oliver, to go and buy sunflowers for his girlfriend, Tori. Joaquin was a senior in my grade, and Tori was a junior at the time. And as Joaquin went to school that day, Manny did not know that that was going to be the last time that he would see his son. That was going to be the last time that Manny was going to be able to work on building the motorcycle that they were building at the time with his son. Manny didn't know that the very violence that he fled from with his family, when he left Venezuela to come to America for a better life, for a better future for his children, he didn't realize at that time that that very same violence is in America too, and that would eventually take his son. In the community that was rated for 8 years straight in the state of Florida as the safest community. That day, in our last period, in 7th period, our door was slightly open because it was a freezing February day. It was 55 degrees. And we wanted the fresh air, so because our door was open, we could hear everything going on around campus. And my building that I was in with my fellow classmates was right next to the freshman building, where a shooting would soon occur. And we first started realizing something was wrong when we heard a pop outside, and I looked over at my seat partner and said, "Hey, that kind of sounded like a gunshot." And my seat partner, in agreement, nodded his head, and we both turned around and asked our teacher to go and close the door, just in case, as many of us have sadly become accustomed to, it was an active shooter drill. Because we had been told beforehand, due to our lack of politicians actually caring about this issue and actually wanting to solve it, we're going to start having active shooter drills to prepare in the same way that we prepare for fires, to prepare for a school shooter, with fake blood and blanks. Thinking that this was one of those drills, we close the door, and immediately after closing the door, the fire alarm goes off. And it was the second time that the fire alarm had gone off that day, but we weren't too surprised because we had a horrible culinary class. I mean, we might as well put the fire department next to the culinary class because they literally caught everything on fire. Everything. I mean it. Like, you could walk in that room, and it still smelled like smoke to this day. But assuming it was just another culinary fire where they had caught their creme brulee on fire or something, we walk outside to our fire evacuation zone, and as we're walking outside, kind of a lighthearted manner, not really expecting this to be, really anything that really matters. As we're walking, I see a flood of kids just start running in the opposite direction of where I'm going, with a look of terror on their face that I've never seen before. And instinctually, when they start yelling, "He's coming this way, he's coming this way," because you don't know if there's just one shooter, you don't know if there's multiple shooters on campus, you don't know if there's going to be bombs around campus in that instance, you don't know where to go. So instinctually, I started following the group of kids that were running in the opposite direction of where I was going. Unknowingly at the time, we were actually running towards where the shooting was occurring. We were running towards the freshman building, where 34 people were going to be shot by the end of the day, and 17 were going to be killed. As we were running towards there, however, a janitor stopped us and said, "Don't come this way, he's over here." And as soon as the janitor said that, coincidentally, the culinary class opened up their classroom and got about 60 students in the culinary classroom in a matter of 30 seconds. And that's where we'd spend the next 2 hours of our lives, not knowing whether or not we were going to make it out of that classroom, not knowing whether or not we would survive, not knowing where the shooting was occurring, not knowing whether or not my sister was still alive because my phone would soon after die, not knowing whether any of our siblings were alive, not knowing whether the shooting had occurred at the middle school next door, where many siblings from our school go to, and not knowing if we were next. And at that time, I did the only thing that I could imagine to do, the only thing that I knew I could do in that moment, which was interview my fellow classmates. Because at the time, I was a student journalist. I was the head of I was one of the lead people at our school's TV production program, where I'd given myself the self-appointed title of news director for a resume piece for college. Yes, yeah. And when I was there, I was interviewing students, not knowing, again, whether this was a drill or not, because those may have been blanks that we heard. But just in case, I wanted to interview my fellow students so that if our souls and our blood was left behind on that floor with our bodies, hopefully our voices would carry on and create some kind of change. Because the SWAT team that would soon break into our classroom to clear us would eventually find our phones if we had been killed, and would look through them and see the video that I had taken beforehand, would see the video that I had taken in case we were shot at the time, so that Congress would have to watch the effects of their inaction on the youth, the effects of gun violence and the scars that it creates across our generation. And luckily, I made it out that day with those other students, but by the end of the day, 34 had been shot and 17 were killed. And one of those people was Joaquin Oliver. And when Joaquin gave Tory the flowers in the period right before he would be killed, they didn't know that that was going to be the last time that they would see each other. They didn't know that was going to be the last time they'd ever be able to hug each other. They didn't know that that was going to be the last time that either of them would see their best friend alive, because they were best friends too. But I want us to recognize one thing from that day, and it's that Joaquin may be gone, but he is very much still here. In the ripple, in the pond that is, in the ocean that is time, in the stone's throw that is a lifetime in that ocean. Even though at the end of the day, at the end of our lives, we all sink to the bottom, the ripples that we create still last on the surface. And those ripples can be turned into waves. Those ripples can be turned into a tsunami that changes the shoreline of this issue in America. Because even if those people aren't here anymore, they live on within us. One person that we met shortly after the shooting was Zion Kelly. Zion had his twin brother killed in the 8th Ward of Washington, D.C., a city plagued by gun violence. His brother was killed on his way home from a college prep class. His name was Zaire Kelly. On his way home from a college prep class, he was shot and killed several hundred feet from his household. Simply wanting to make a better future for him and his family got him killed because he was in the wrong place. But you know how the media covered his death compared to Joaquin's? Zaire's death was covered as gang violence in Washington, D.C., even though he was on his way home from a college prep class. And following the shooting at our school, when we started planning all of these different protests, when we started planning the walkout, the way students on the north and south side of Chicago got treated was vastly different. On the north side, and primarily white communities, the way it got covered by the media was, oh, this is wonderful. Our kids are practicing their First Amendment rights, and this is so great, right? This is the first time anybody stood up to gun violence. But when they started walking out on the south and west side of Chicago, which they had been doing for years before against the violence in their own community and against police brutality as well, the way that they got covered, even on the same day when students across America from every zip code walked out, of every race and every ethnicity walked out against the same issue in the same nonviolent matter, you know how the kids on the south side got covered? They didn't get reporters on the ground asking them why they were doing this. They didn't get reporters asking, like, wow, these kids are so great. Look at them standing up against gun violence. They got threatened with suspension and expulsion. They got threatened with police outside of their schools that were ready to arrest them and further throw them into the school-to-prison pipeline. The way that they got covered was from a news helicopter that made it look like a violent protest when they were just as nonviolent as us. That is something our generation doesn't need to change. That is something that we have to change. We have to realize that the validity of our suffering as youth, the validity of our suffering as any other defining characteristic, no matter our sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, or religion, cannot be defined by any of those defining characteristics other than one. And that is the fact that we are human beings that live in America and that we need not suffer. Because we cannot claim to be the greatest country on earth if we only care about people in certain zip codes and not about every single person that lives here. We cannot claim that if we continuously say people are illegal on stolen land. We cannot say that again and again when children get shot on their way to school, but we have a school safety commission only on school violence. My question is, where's the safety commission on community safety for the majority of kids that get killed on their way to school or outside of their school? Because that's what a majority of gun violence in America looks like. A majority of gun violence in America looks like and happens in the communities that mayors and politicians don't like to talk about, where they like to determine the validity of their suffering based off of their zip code. But the only thing that can change that in the first place is us turning out to vote as youth, no matter where we come from, so that whoever is running for local office, whoever is running in Congress, whoever is running for our state legislature has to represent the youth no matter where they come from, because they realize that no matter if they're Democrats or Republicans, if they don't represent and care about the issues that affect us as youth, whether that be environmental justice, economic justice, or any other form of justice, if they do not care about us, we will vote them out. That is the importance of voting as youth. When former presidents and politicians and older people go out there and say, oh, you need to go out and vote, realize we can't look at it that way. The way we have to look at it is that we have to vote, not because we should, but we have to vote for our survival as a generation. We have to vote against the corporations that are currently being represented in Congress. Because in the Supreme Court's decision of Citizens United, it was decided that corporations are people. I don't consider corporations people. Do you guys? No? 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 Go out and vote on that then. Because the reason why our generation is facing this oppression, the reason why youth across America are facing this oppression is because we are not being represented. And when I say youth, I don't just mean young people. I mean every person that believes in change. Every person that's out there fighting for what's idealistic to change what is realistic, because we realize what is going on in America right now is unacceptable. The fact that kids are worried about whether or not they're going to make it out of their classroom, the fact that the difference between life and death can be determined by whether or not you go to the park in a hoodie and get a bag of Skittles, the difference between life and death can be whether or not you turn left or right down your classroom hallway. The difference between life and death cannot be, we cannot let it be any of those defining characteristics. We can't let it be anything other than the fact that you're just getting older and you're dying of old age, right? Because we are letting thousands of young people die across America every day as a result of inaction of our Congress, because we have not pressured them enough on this. But that is starting to change. And you know how? I can tell. Because yesterday, for the first time in 8 years, or 2 days ago, for the first time in 8 years, we had the first hearing on gun violence prevention. And I want you guys to realize that is not because Congress all of a sudden decided to do the right thing. It's because we forced them to. We, the young people, forced them to. We, the young people, need to realize that if we are not being fairly represented on our school boards, if we are not being fairly represented in Congress, in our state legislatures, or in any other place, that is not an excuse for us just to sit back and take it. That is an excuse for us to sit back, not to sit back, and to stand up and run against those people and get ourselves elected as the youth. Because we know that the only thing that is going to change this issue, the only thing that is ever going to save our planet and our generation, is by the youth running for local office and actually fighting for the next generation that follows us, and not our special interests that are funding our campaigns. We have to realize that we can create the future that we wish to see in America, a future free from gun violence, a future where a nation of immigrants on stolen land doesn't fear refugees. We can create a future where there is a next generation, a future where companies that actively benefit off of destroying the environment and profit off of that are actually held accountable. The companies that actively are participating in killing our youth are held accountable. Because the fact of the matter is, gun manufacturers benefit off of mass shootings. Because after every mass shooting, gun sales go up by triple digits. And they realize that if we enact these laws, gun sales are going to go down. So what do they do in this situation? They use the one organization they know how to use most, the National Rifle Association. Through memberships and advertising in their magazines, they're able to provide millions of dollars for a fear-mongering organization that is fought for things like stopping gun violence research. And I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican and an NRA member or a non-NRA member. I We cannot ever support, our generation can never stand with an organization that actively fights to stop gun violence research. The National Rifle Association created a law known as the Dickey Amendment that some of us may have heard of, where they made it federally illegal to study gun violence. And on top of that, even though the youth were able to fight to get that amendment changed, you know what they did? They used the people that they had on the House Appropriations Committee to make sure that we couldn't fund research into an issue that kills 40,000 Americans annually. I don't know about you guys, but I choose not to stand with an organization that stands in the way of something as basic as research at a government level for an issue that kills 40,000 American, primarily children, annually. And even though you may be thinking to yourself, well, the NRA stands for gun safety, they don't at all. You know how I can tell? Because guns are not put under the Consumer Protection Act. The fact that toy guns are more regulated for safety in America than actual guns is a testament to that issue. Because guns that are produced domestically are not allowed to be regulated under the Consumer Protection Act. So legally, there is a situation where you could be sold a weapon that randomly goes off, where, for example, if you're out and hunting with your sibling and that weapon accidentally goes off and there's nobody around, you could go to prison for murder, even if you didn't shoot that person in the first place, because the weapon accidentally went off. But you know what's even worse after that? You can't sue that gun manufacturer because the NRA made it so that we can't sue gun manufacturers because of the Fair Commerce and Arms Act. We need gun manufacturers. We need the NRA to be held accountable. We need to realize that gun violence in America cannot be a partisan issue. The changing of our climate and the obliteration of our environment cannot be a partisan issue. And we have to go out and create that change for ourselves, because there will be nobody else to do that. And I don't say this to scare us. I say this to inspire us. I say this to make us realize that no matter where we stand on the spectrum of a political ideology, that spectrum is no longer going to be there, because we no longer will be unless we stand up immediately and start taking action, unless we go out there and start organizing as soon as possible against violence and corruption of every form, against every form of injustice, against every form of racism and ageism that our generation faces. Because when people look at us and say, young people don't know what they're talking about, they can't create change, they clearly didn't study history, right? Because, yeah. Because when Congress comes up with an anti-immigrant sentiment, not only is that incredibly hypocritical, it's historically false. When they say that young people don't know what they're talking about, and that especially young immigrants don't know what they're talking about, they forget that almost all the founding fathers were immigrants. They forget the fact that, for example, Alexander Hamilton was an incredibly similar situation to what hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans are in right now. Where at the age of 17, Alexander Hamilton had to flee his home in the West Indies and come to the United States and helped found the world's largest economy. John Lewis was 17 when he started organizing. We are purposely taught our history in a way that makes it seem like history cannot be replicated. We're taught in a way that young people can't create change, when in fact it's only ever been the young people that have challenged the status quo that ever has created change. So are we ready to create it? Yes. Are we? So with that very mentality, and realizing that the youth across America have this same mentality from every zip code and every background, after the millions of kids that walked out, we did the march. And then following the march, where we thought we were going to get 90 people in Washington, D.C., a solid 90 people in Washington, D.C., we ended up getting over 1 million, thanks to you guys. After that, we thought to ourselves, what is the best way to take on the NRA? When we're a bunch of kids with not a lot of money, right? And we thought to ourselves, well, let's look back to the Civil Rights Movement and the Freedom Riders and what they've done. And we asked ourselves on top of that, how do we make people realize that mass shootings and gun violence are an intersectional issue and that they're the same issue because they're both forms of gun violence? So what we decided to do was go on a bus tour across America and spend our entire summer over 63 days, going across America to more congressional districts than any other presidential campaign had visited in the same time period. And the way we made our plan to visit these congressional districts was that we went to the districts where the most kids walked out, where the voter differential was low enough that if all of those kids that walked out that can vote voted, that we could vote an NRA-backed politician out of office. With the goal of raising youth voter turnout in Florida and in over 31 states and every state in the United States, we set out across the country to do this. And when we set out, quite frankly, we didn't know what we were doing. We were kind of confused as young people. You know, it's kind of daunting to not only live through what so many kids at our school had lived through, but also continue that momentum and just see the challenge ahead and see a billion-dollar corporation that is trying to challenge this and trying to make sure that we can't even study gun violence research so that we can fund gun violence research and we can know the solutions that work. Because we know that if guns made us safer, we would not be having this conversation right now. Because for every 100 people in the United States, there's over 101 guns. There are more guns than people in our country. And if guns made us safer, we would not be having this conversation right now. Fact of the matter is, if it was a good guy with a gun that stopped a bad guy with a gun, when they say that, you know what they're actually trying to do? Sell you 2 guns. They're trying to fearmonger and scare us. Because you know what they don't talk about when they say that you need a gun in your household to protect you? They don't talk about the fact that during home invasions and different self-defense instances when people are breaking into houses, a majority of the time, they're not breaking in to kill you. They're breaking in to steal your stuff. And public pulling of criminals that have been incarcerated and thrown in prison for committing these acts, when we ask them, why did you have a weapon in the first place, it's for self-defense in case the homeowner was there and if they had a gun specifically. To the point where the odds of you being killed if you use a gun in self-defense in your household, if you have a weapon in your household during a home invasion, are twice as high as you using a baseball bat. Because the majority of the time when someone's breaking into a house, it's an economically driven crime. It's not driven by wanting to aimlessly kill people. And on top of that, guns are one of the most stolen items in America. There is a massive amount of home invasions that are actually predicated on the fact that criminals know that there is a massive that there's a massive storage of guns in households, to the point where 3% of Americans own 50% of the guns. Right? And we have to realize that what's not going to end the scourge of suicide is not only improving our mental health care system in our schools and in our communities, it's also going to be child access prevention laws and mandatory waiting periods for gun sales, so that the majority of people that actually do die as a result of guns, which are suicides, can be reduced. Because we know that even though mental health has been increased and mental health care has been significantly increased across the country over the past couple of years, suicides have gone up over 28%. And that predominantly affects middle-class, young white men, which is also the key demographic for gun ownership. And we know that the odds of somebody killing themselves when there's a gun in their household, assuming it's safely stored, kept locked and unloaded and in a safe, is 5 times higher, regardless of whether or not anybody in that household is the gun owner. If there's a family with 4.3 million families across America have guns that are that are kept unsafe, that are kept fully loaded, unlocked, and out in the open. The odds of somebody in that household, the odds of a child in that household killing themselves because of that gun being in the household is 9 times higher. And I know you may be thinking to yourself, well, why aren't they just going to attempt a different way? Well, I'll tell you. It's because a vast majority of suicide attempts in the United States are with overdosing. However, it's only successful 2% of the time, while guns are successful in death by suicide over 90% of the time, typically. And 90% of individuals who survive their first attempt do not reattempt. We know this issue is out here. And the fact of the matter is, when the NRA campaigns against universal background checks, they're trying to arm the very criminals that they say that you need guns to protect yourself from. When they say that again and again that this is unconstitutional to require, for example, a license to buy a weapon, even though you need a license to go and fish. I don't understand why on God's green earth you shouldn't need a license to buy a gun in the first place, right? When they're campaigning against these laws and they say they're unconstitutional, you know what else has been unconstitutional in the past? People of color getting the right to vote. Women getting the right to vote. So many other issues that we faced across America, and these massive movements are always written off as being unconstitutional and that nothing can happen. But you know what happens is the young people across America speak up against injustice and realize that there is a serious issue that we must face here. From the women's suffrage movement to the civil rights movement, to the gun violence prevention movement. They all have this one thing in common. It's the fact that it's individuals like y'all that go out there and change this. And realizing that there is this massive change that has to be made in the first place. And when we went across the country and we spoke to as many youth activists as possible, and we brought people on our bus to go out and speak on panels about what their community lives through, like Bria Smith from Milwaukee, who has been trying to fight against and organize against gun violence for decades in her community, and she's 18. She started organizing when she was 8 years old. Because we realized that communities in America where activists are oftentimes found, people are not born activists. People are not born thinking, I'm going to grow up to be an activist. People are forced to become activists. People are forced to become organizers because they have to organize for their own survival. And even if you think to yourself that, oh, this doesn't affect my community, this is not some issue that I should really care about because it doesn't really affect here, even if it doesn't affect here, realize that Parkland was the safest community in Florida for 8 years straight. This can literally happen anywhere. And the only way that we can change this is not going to be by militarizing our schools and arming teachers. The way that we change this is by funding violence intervention programs like the Life Camp in New York City, where they hire former criminal convicts that have gone through the criminal justice system and use them and their community connections to help stop and interrupt shootings before they happen. We know these programs are able to reduce gun violence in the communities they've been implemented in, even without calling for new gun laws, by 40 to 70% within their first year of implementation on average. In one community that I visited on our road to change, where a woman that has been working in gun violence prevention for several decades has been organizing and started an organization called Life Camp in Jamaica, Queens. In one community that they started working in 2002, where there were previously 17 murders in 2001, they have had 1 murder in the past 17 years. We know that these laws work. We know that the right combination of criminal justice reform and gun violence prevention intersects. Because we realize that if throwing people in jail ended gun violence, we would not be having this conversation right now. We realize how every community across America, as a generation, we must realize how every community across America oftentimes is affected differently by their legislators and cared about differently by their legislators because of what the community looks like. Just as an example, the difference of treatment between the crack epidemic and the opioid epidemic. When it was the crack epidemic, the way we treated it was everybody that uses crack is a criminal, and we need to throw them in prison, right? And that we need to incarcerate all these people for their own addictions, which primarily affected communities of color. But when it's the opioid epidemic that primarily affects white communities of privilege, you know how we treat it? With billions of dollars of aid and a public health approach of not incarcerating people. We have to realize our own privilege in communities across America. We have to realize that, for example, Marjory Stoneman Douglas got significantly more coverage than most schools that are ever affected by gun violence because it doesn't happen in their schools, it happens outside. And we have to realize as a generation, only stopping bullets from coming inside of our schools is not going to stop gun violence outside of our schools, because we know that we have to stop shooters before they get on campus. We know that one of the #1 predictors of a school shooter or a mass shooter is a history of domestic abuse. And we know that only 13 states have the laws, like the one that we fought to create in Florida, that could have disarmed the shooter at our school, because even though the FBI and law enforcement was called on them 38 times, we couldn't disarm them because of the NRA blocking a law that could have disarmed him in the first place, known as an extremist protection order, where a judge can rule on whether or not somebody is a risk to themselves and others and take their guns away in the first place. In Florida, there was a plotted mass shooting shortly after our school shooting at the University of Central Florida, which has a campus and student body of over 60,000 students, where somebody was buying several assault-style weapons and thousands of rounds of ammunition and had plans to kill hundreds of people, if not thousands, on that campus. But because of the law that we created, they were able to disarm that person. The greatest danger to us changing the world as a generation is not having a lack of issues to solve. I guarantee that. The biggest danger, the biggest obstacle to us stopping our own death as a generation is our own futility. It's the belief that we can't. The biggest obstacle to us saving lives is believing that there's nothing that any individual can do. It's believing that there's nothing that you can do as an individual, but I guarantee you there is. And it's called voting and running for office as well, if you're so inclined to do so, which I encourage. Because the fact is, if we are not represented by every age, in the same way as if we're not represented by every demographic in Congress, we will never be accurately represented. That is why, as the youth, we have to go and talk to our school boards and make sure that there is youth representation from actual students within the schools that are making rules about the schools, right? Because that is ridiculous. Because I don't know about you guys, but I don't like being told what to do as a student by somebody that hasn't been in school for over 30 years. Because that's just ridiculous. And it's absurd. We have to organize and make sure that we are actually getting represented within our schools so we can fund better mental health care, so that we can actually get guidance counselors that are not just schedulers, but are actual guidance counselors, right? Think about the issues that we face within our schools, and I guarantee you the suffering that you face as an individual is not solely you, but everyone around you as well. But the only thing that's going to change it is by the first person starting to talk about it, and that individual can be you. So I will leave you with this message. Do not wait. Do not wait for a school shooting to become active. Do not wait for another instance of gun violence inside or outside of your school to become active. Start talking to your adults. Start talking to your local elected officials and get youth representation, not just on your school board. Get youth representation in your city council as well, so that the kids that grow up here for years and spend 18 years of their life in this city can actually be represented at the legislative level of the city council. Right? We have to create this change. And we can create it so long as we believe. So long as we believe that gun violence is not a partisan issue. So long as we go out and vote, no matter which political party we're voting for, we vote for individuals that accurately represent us demographically and ideologically, both in terms of age, race, ethnicity, and any other defining characteristic that looks like you. Because until we have representation within Congress, this issue doesn't change. Until we have actual representation of people and not the corporations within Congress, and not the heads of corporations within Congress, this issue will not change, but it can. So long as we don't wait, and so long as we believe in ourselves, we can change this. So long as you think about an issue that you care about, whether it be immigration or climate change, or school violence, or gun violence, or anything else, if you care about that issue, get a group of friends together and start organizing around it. And yes, there are going to be times that you fail again and again, but those are the only times that you ever learn. And trust me, there's a lot of failure in politics. We've already seen it in Congress, right? That's the only time that we can create change, though. And the only thing that ever has changed the world is a small group of determined individuals that believe they can. So go out and do it. Thank you. One second. Don't just clap, vote, for God's sake. Run for city council. You can take over your local government through good trouble and elections. As scary as that may seem, the fact of the matter is, I just want to reiterate for one moment, if you think that you're not qualified enough to run for local politics, realize that a majority of local politics is an elected cocktail party. That has to change, because that's why these issues continue. Because people don't actually run for office to get elected to change something. They run for office to make their friends call themselves like mayor instead of just like another like parent, for example. Run for office and create this change yourselves, or it's not going to be changed. Thank you. Also, the age to run for Congress is 25 for anybody that wonders. So go and do it.
So thank you, everyone, for being so respectful while David was speaking. We do have a couple of minutes to have questions from the audience. Questions are going to come either from myself or Ms. Cannoni. So if you've got a question, if you raise your hand, we'll come up to you. We'll ask you what your question's going to be and then let you ask through the mic.
Hi, thank you for coming, first of all. Stand up? Okay. How do you deal with like people that say like you're too young, or you don't know what you're talking about, or like that you're just kind of like yelling things and not really know what's going on? Thanks.
The fact that I just got a standing ovation talking about issues shouldn't exist means that we are not too young to be talking about these issues, right? Amen. And on top of that, one of the most terrifying things that I've realized as an individual that has talked to a majority of Congress is how little congressmen and politicians actually know. It's horrifying. Because we've created a political system where every politician is expected to know a lot about everything, but they end up knowing nothing about anything. Right? And the best way to counter that is by educating yourself and reading books on a specific issue that you're interested in, like gun violence prevention, feminism, or youth activism, right? By believing in like women's empowerment and realizing that the #1 predictor of a quality of life in a country is accessibility of education for women, right?
So you mentioned that the NRA lobbied against gun violence research, but you refrained to mention that the CDC completed a study anyway. Does your assertion that more guns causes more violence change, considering the CDC found guns are either fired or brandished in self-defense between 300,000 and upwards of 2 million times per year?
Well, the fact of the matter is I'll say this. If guns made us safer, we wouldn't be having this conversation again. And on top of that, first off, thank you for asking that question and having this conversation and being here in the first place, because that's the only way this issue changes. Because even though you may disagree with me with my approach to gun violence prevention, I think we can both agree that gun violence is something that shouldn't continue, right? And on top of that, the laws, the research that the CDC is allowed to do is only about who's getting shot. It's not actually about the effectiveness of gun laws at a state level. And we have to realize that there's a reason why America has the highest rate of gun violence of any more developed country in the world. And it's not because there's millions and billions of more guns in those other countries that are being brandished in self-defense. It's because people that shouldn't have guns in the first place in those countries are not able to get them. So thank you.
When you said that that Parkland was the safest town in Florida, how do you explain to people that, but like by helping people in other communities, you're also helping yourself because it's not like zero-sum politics?
What? Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
How do you explain to people that like by helping people in other communities, you're helping yourself, even if you're directly benefiting like from those specific, like how do you explain to people that you're also by helping other people, you're helping yourself?
So the way I explain that is by using my platform to raise other people's voices that have been working on this issue. To not just throw this platform away that I've been given and many of the students of Parkland have been given, and expanding it to create an intersectional movement to gun violence of every community, of every socioeconomic level, of every race and every different thing. Because the only personal benefit I look to get from this is to be able to end gun violence so that nobody else has to live through what my sister lived through that day when she lost 4 friends.
I was just wondering, like, what would be your opinion on having like a law where you have to register your guns, similar to the way people like register their cars, maybe like every other year or something like that, to make sure guns don't get in the hands of the wrong people? Like, you could call it like a national registry of armaments or something like that. Like, do you have an opinion on that?
I support it.
Okay.
Because the argument against that is that guns are needed to fight off a tyrannical government, when in reality, a vast majority of the time in violent revolutions are disproportionately unsuccessful compared to nonviolent revolutions. And a vast majority of them aren't even democracies several years after that. And I think I would rather talk about the fact that 40,000 Americans are dying annually as a result of guns in America than talking about something that's a hypothetical. Because what's not a hypothetical is the fact that when we went to the south side of Chicago and kids started talking about all the kids that had died there in the past school year, what's not a hypothetical is the fact that it took them 11 minutes to read off the 150 names of the kids under the age of 21 that had been killed in a 10-block radius, right? So, yeah.
Oh, and I got.
Hi. You said that the NRA made it illegal to do gun research. How do we get the research on gun violence, and where did your sources come from?
So those are privately funded, and they're primarily done through colleges and universities. Like Harvard has a really good school of public health policy where they have donors that help fund issues into gun violence research, and that's how they're able to do it in the first place. Because sadly, most of this is privately funded by really mainly private schools that can afford to do this research in the first place, such as UC Davis, well, that's a public school, but Harvard and several others. Just to show you the scope of the lack of funding that's into these, on these issues. Do you guys know how many gun violence researchers there are in America that study gun violence full time? It's 8. They're in a group chat together. Seriously, I want a pool of gun violence researchers to study the 40,000 Americans that die annually as a result of guns. That can't fit in a group chat. Because no matter where we stand on this issue, that's something that we need to fund more research into in the first place, to be able to have these conversations. So yeah. I'll do one more question.
Hi. So you said how starting things about you're passionate about, and for example, I'm really interested in feminism and everything like that. So how do you start? How do you even begin? Do you get a group of people? Can you start yourself?
Well, I think the main way that you have to start is by educating your friends around you, and especially the people around at your school that may not understand, for example, what feminism actually means. Because I know going through high school myself, many men hear feminism and they think women above men, and that's not the case at all. It actually means equality. And for example, when we're talking about toxic masculinity, that alienates the very group that we're trying to talk to in the first place, because they hear toxic man and they don't actually understand that masculinity is just a concept. It's not something that you have to be involved in. The fact that as a young man, I was raised in America where many men are, in fact, every man is raised with these media role models that show that it's not okay to feel sad. It's not okay to feel any other emotion other than angry. It's not okay to act any other way than violent, when in reality, we cannot let our emotions be a gendered issue. It has to be a human issue in the first place. So, yeah.
Hi. Thank you for being here today. My only question is, do you think that if Broward County did their job and actually went to the shooter's house on the 39 tips and the FBI's 2 tips, that there would still have been a shooting?
I mean, they did try to do their job as best as they could in that instance. They didn't have the law in place. They didn't have extremist protection orders where they could have disarmed the shooter in the first place. Because the fact of the matter is, an 18-year-old any American should not be able to get their hands on a gun that is like the AR-15 with an effective range of over several hundred feet. Because if you were shooting somebody from several hundred feet away, you are not defending yourself, you are hunting. Thank you guys so much. You guys are awesome.